All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, October 19th of 2021. It is NBA opening night. Super excited to be here on stream today. I know there are probably going to be a bunch of questions as we are gearing up for the start of NBA. We've been pumping out a ton of NBA content recently. So if you haven't seen all that stuff, I recommend going and checking some of that out on our YouTube channel. But what are we doing here on stream today? I know we'll probably have a bunch of new viewers. This is a live open Q&A style show where I answer questions about SaberSim, about DFS strategy, whatever you guys want to talk about. So we've got NBA opening night going on tonight. I'm sure we're going to be getting a ton of NBA questions here on stream today and tomorrow. Happy to talk about any NBA strategy, whatever questions you have about how to use SaberSim to build better NBA lineups, anything you guys want. If there are some NFL questions, maybe even some lingering MLB questions, I think at this point in the season, probably not so much baseball, but NFL questions are totally welcome here too as well. For those of you guys that are new to the stream, we do this show typically every weekday, Monday through Friday at this time, 2 p.m. Eastern. So always feel free to tune in, ask whatever questions you have. I see Paul's here. Welcome, Paul. What's going on? Welcome, everybody. I see the stream count is going up here. Excited to be here today. Before we get into questions here and start diving in, a few notes. Everyone's trial status on SaberSim was reset yesterday. If you have tried us out in the past, maybe took a break, maybe didn't like it the last time you tried, come back, give us a try this week for NBA. We've made a ton of improvements to the app since the last time you've probably seen it. We pushed out a full redesign. We've been working really hard on the NBA model and the simulator for NBA, so the projections are a lot better. We've made improvements to our ownership model. Our ownership model is a lot more accurate now. So I recommend coming back, giving us a try. No strings attached for 7 days. You can check us out. So you'll get an opportunity if you sign up today. You can play NBA opening night. You can play NBA all week. You could try the Thursday night football game on Thursday night. You could play football on Sunday and even get a chance to play some more NBA at the start of next week before you even have to pay a dime. So really just a great deal. Highly recommend coming and checking out the free 7-day trial, even if you've tried us before. But anyway, let's see. I do have a few questions that came in via email last night in response to the email we sent out preparing for this stream here. So I'm going to jump to the questions I was getting in email here first. We'll talk about those. As always, feel free to pop any questions you have for me into YouTube chat or into the Office Hours channel in our Slack community if you are in Slack. I will answer questions in about the same order that they come in. So I'll tackle these things as they come in. If you are not in our Slack community and you're interested in joining, I think in NBA in particular can be really useful for seeing when sims are running. We will have sim alerts going off in our Slack channel, in the NBA lineup alerts channel. So definitely recommend joining Slack if you haven't already. There's a link to join Slack in the description of every past Office Hours video. So this one will have it as soon as this video is up on YouTube, but any past Office Hours video will also have a link to join. So see a few other people have joined up here now. A few questions already trickling in. Welcome, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started here in just a moment. Cool. So let me go ahead and grab some of these questions that came in here overnight in email. And this first one was from Brian here. So this question's actually, I think this question was phrased around NHL in particular, but it is works really well for NBA too, where there is news breaking constantly. So we'll go ahead. Let's pull up this question. Oh God, this did not come in correctly. All right, so the question says, my question involves lineup updates. SaberSim reacts pretty quickly to news. I noticed on Slack that a sim of a game was rerunning, and I jumped over to my Twitter list of NHL beat reporters to find out why, only to find out that a goalie switch had been announced a few minutes before. In this case, absolutely made sense to wait for the sim to complete and rebuild my lineup since I had pretty heavy exposure to the goalie that had been removed. Given the nature of the sim, my understanding is that even if I didn't have any exposure to a player who was switched out, there likely is an impact on projections for the players that I have rostered. I assume the absolute best practice is to rebuild lineups every time the sim reruns, or at least after the latest sim before lineup lock for a given game. However, we don't all have time to stare at the NHL lineup alert Slack channel, so I'm curious what the experts do. Thus far, my process has been to build lineups about an hour or two before lock, And then the rest of the question says, then rebuild 15 to 20 minutes before lock and as time allows a write-up to lock. Is it okay to just let a lineup ride? When should you drop everything and rebuild? And again, this question is very NHL focused, but I think it is applicable for NBA too, because we will have news breaking like this for NBA throughout the season, right? This is going to happen all the time. And when do we need to, because breaking news comes out, when do we need to adjust? And when can we just let things go? And to be completely honest, I'm gonna, phrase this from what I think is actually legitimately best practice here. And the way I approach my lineups, I'm going to be late swapping and updating things right up until the last minute to account for every little bit of news that I can, especially I don't play too much NHL, but in NBA in particular, news that breaks is going to such dramatically change the projections of every other player on the team, right? In a sport that is lower variance where projections matter heavily, even the difference of, two teams that just for example, for tonight, right? We've got, we don't have starting lineups yet, but let's say that we have got the Lakers and, Dwight Howard and DeAndre Jordan. Well, Anthony Davis is probably going to start at the 5, right? But let's say that, at some point in the season, you've got a situation where these two guys are splitting, Dwight Howard and DeAndre Jordan are splitting different starting minutes at the 5. And even a pivot from one person to the other, right, between these two guys would such dramatically impact the way that the salaries work out and lineup constructions work out for the slate. Even if I didn't have a lot of one center, I would want to adjust and make sure that I now had the most up-to-date information in my lineups. Now, the most negative EV thing you can do is miss lock, right? So I would never, if news breaks 5 minutes before lock, and you are not going to have time to do your entire process, right? The last thing you want to do is just fail to get lineups in at all. So I wouldn't be waiting until the very last second to get your lineups in. Make sure you have something in. Make sure, I really like the idea here of what this user mentioned here, of saying that he likes to get his kind of final run in 15 to 20 minutes before and then adjust if needed as time allows. I think that's the right approach. This is a difficult question to answer, and this is a difficult thing. There's this comment here. We don't all have time to stare at the lineup alert Slack channel all night. And the reality is I think if you aren't going to be able to adjust to the news that is breaking throughout the night in sports like NBA, NHL, I think you are legitimately leaving money on the table. There was a question yesterday that basically said, how should I play NBA on a night that I know I'm not going to be able to late swap? And I think this is true for NHL too. And I legitimately said I wouldn't. I think the ultimate best practice approach of what I would recommend is that for these sports where every sim that runs is really, it's paramount. There could be a lot of information, a lot of value packed into just even a few different minutes moving around on a team. I think you need to be updating. I think you need to be updating your lineups before lock. You need to be updating via late swap. You should not put yourself in a situation where you are missing lock or you are missing an opportunity to late swap because you've re-swapped so many times or you're taking up so much time. But you should be essentially swapping to, I would say, with every news break that comes out for NBA. For NHL, again, I'm a little less familiar. I think the thing that really primarily will come out after NHL lock is these goalie swaps or line changes, right? Different line discrepancies that weren't expected at lock. It's the same deal. Line changes in NHL can dramatically change the way players are correlated to one another. Even if the projections in a higher variance sport like NHL, the projections may not be changing as dramatically, but the correlations between players when we resim the game are going to change dramatically if we get unexpected line changes, right? Those kinds of things are also very crucial to be tuned into and to stay plugged into. So if you are going into a slate where you don't think you're going to have the ability to do that, I would take the slate off. And on the nights that you can afford to adjust as you need throughout the slate, especially these big slates, tomorrow we have 11 games, I would say late swap every time news is breaking. And if news breaks right before lock that affects the games at lock, then rebuild. I think the most effective NBA processes, the most effective NBA DFS processes are ones that you can repeat and do quickly with 15 minutes or less, because you are regularly going to have to do that all season long. So Anyway, good question. I'm not sure, Brian. I imagine Brian's not here, but Brian, I'll get you a timestamp recording of this stream here with that answer, and let me know if you have any follow-up questions there as well. A couple other questions that came in through our emails, our responses to our emails we sent out yesterday. I'll hit these first, and then we'll start getting to some of these questions I'm seeing in chat here. Cool. So, good question from Kyle here. And Kyle said, quick question regarding the opening slate for NBA tonight. Obviously, with a 2-game slate total, ownership is going to be higher compared to tomorrow's slate of 11 games. That being said, what should we target for maximum ownership tonight, or what is considered too high for a 2-game slate? So one of the unique things that we do here with SaberSim is our approach to handling ownership is a little bit more robust than what you'll see on a traditional optimizer, is doing a little bit more for you than you might expect intuitively. So we handle ownership primarily with this ownership fade slider, which is going to be set to a default value based on the contest's parameters that you give us here. So if you're playing maybe like the and one on DraftKings, the $1 20 max, right, would be a contest 20 max 50K entrance, and we're going to set this slider to high, some value here. And what we are basically saying there is, well, what's actually happening there is that this slider has, well, all the sliders have been back tested by building thousands of lineups at every individual combination of slider combos, comparing the expected value of the lineups that come out for a 2-game slate for this particular contest. And the default values are set where we find that the optimal lineups get made. So what ownership fade is actually doing is it is comparing the average, it's comparing that player's projected ownership to the average ownership at a position for any given position here. And then also comparing that player's variance or their range of outcomes in our simulation data to determine if that player is good chalk or bad chalk. So what does this all mean in terms of the practical impacts of this? Oh, wait, I have min uniques on too. I don't want that. Hold on one sec. The practical impact of this is that you are going to get a variety of different lineups with different ownership sums in step 3, and I don't think it is the best thing to focus on, right? What is actually happening here is if we're going to get a lineup, well, I guess I'll let the lineups build and then we'll just take a look because the builds go pretty fast here for NBA. We've spent a lot of work in the offseason here making these builds run as quickly as possible, so especially with default settings, you're going to find that these builds really fly this season. But so we do have to edit a couple projections. Oh, it looks like we do have some starting lineups coming out now. We have some confirmed players for the games here. Okay, so we're going to see, let's go ahead and make this a little bit bigger, right? We're going to see that we're going to get some variety in our ownership sums for these different lineups, right? We've got as high as 247, as low as 197, 289, right? Significantly different ownership sums. And what we're essentially saying is that these lineups have equivalent expected value in the contest we're playing. So despite the fact that this lineup has 197% projected ownership and this lineup has 289% projected ownership, we actually can kind of see that the difference there is explained where we have a lineup that succeeds much more at the average, right? It has a higher average projected score, probably has a little bit higher raw upside, but this lineup maybe stands to be a little bit more profitable if the players in this lineup hit their ceiling outcomes, right? So we have two lineups that are actually have a very similar expected value, right? Over a long period of time, despite the fact that they have a very different ownership sum and a very different projected score. All of this is to say, I wouldn't worry too much about this projected ownership. Or this projected ownership sum. I don't think this number is very useful, actually, in terms of determining how likely the lineup is to be duplicated. I also don't think it's very useful in determining how likely it is to be a profitable lineup, right? So I know that is maybe not the most satisfying answer here, but I think it's something that can probably be removed from your process. We don't have a lot of options to sort by ownership sum or filter by it at the moment. This is mostly just a visualization of some of the other data that we have down here at the bottom, a way to visualize the total lineup ownership, but I don't think it's very useful. It doesn't enter into my process very much. So I let ownership fade kind of make some of those decisions for me. So, but good question, Kyle. Again, I'll get you a recording to this video as well. Let me know if you have any follow-up here for me. Cool. All right. I'm going to go ahead and quickly jump to some of these questions that have come in here in YouTube chat so far. So this one came from Paul. He said, what big player would you fade tonight? So, a lot of times when I come on the show, I don't really like to come on here and tout and give you my favorite plays. I definitely prefer to come from the approach of, running test builds on SaberSim and seeing what we're kind of getting out of that. And I actually was exploring a lot of this earlier today before the stream even started. So we'll go back to this build here. Actually, you know what? Let's start fresh and let's talk about what I mean by a test build. So one of my favorite ways to just get familiar with the slate and kind of see what the model is thinking, right? What the simulator is thinking here, is to just run builds on default settings and see what we're getting out of it, right? So it depends on what contest you're playing. That's the big thing. I guess I should back up is, why do we not like to tout on this show? The main reason why is because there are discrepancies in your contest size, in the payout structure, the site you're playing, right? All of these different things can really affect like whether a play is a good player to add into a lineup. Even the rest of the lineup, right? If you told me that you had a given set of 7 players and then were asking me if you should play, I don't know, Steph Curry or Kevin Durant, right, in the remaining spot, it would depend on the ownership of the rest of the lineup and who the other players are you have in the lineup, right? All these other factors. So just giving out like our favorite fades or locks is something we often don't really do here. But one of my favorite ways to get familiar with the slate and how I would recommend you kind of think about some of these questions for yourself is to run test builds on SaberSim with just default settings that would fit your contest. So again, let's run another one of these here. We'll start totally fresh. I know we just did this here, but wanted to kind of set the stage there first. So we'll run a build here and we can just see what we're getting. So one of my favorite things to do here when I'm looking at, for example, what kind of players does SaberSim want to fade? What are some of the big fades that the model is kind of doing already by default? Again, remember here, we're not optimizing for projected score, right? We are optimizing, taking into account ownership, and the builder's already trying to find some opportunities to fade. So one of the easy ways to figure out, where are the big fades on a slate like this here, is to just sort by ownership and look what's popping up, and compare our exposures to the projected ownership. And we can even do this here, looking at our entire pool of 500 lineups, and seeing what kind of plays we are getting at the high ownership. So, two guys that jump immediately off the page here, at least on DraftKings. Well, actually, let's look at like 150 lineups. We're a little bit under here on guys on some of these big name value plays like Poole and Bruce Brown. Not huge fades, right? But just a little bit under the field. Maybe our first kind of big fades here are guys like Andrew Wiggins and Grayson Allen. Builder indicating to us that maybe the chalky value plays are not the best chalk tonight. We're even with the field on a guy like Harden, who I think is going to be the most popular stud option tonight. Over the field on some of these other kind of next studs that are popping here, Steph Curry, Giannis. I think this projected ownership maybe is a little bit low at the moment, but well over on Giannis too. So we're starting to put together an image of the slate here, at least with the way that the model is attacking it at the moment. So, but again, this is only for this particular contest. If you told me you were just playing a single bullet tonight, single entry, we would have a different approach, right? We would set our single entry. Maybe it's just a, what is that? 5,000 person entry, right? Ownership fade is going to come down a lot. We'll get a different result here. We'll get a different approach to fading here, overall. And the other thing to remember too is that it's noon here. The slate locks in about 5 hours from now. We only have, it looks like the starting lineup for one team. We have the Warriors lineup, but news is going to change a lot. We'll run some more sims throughout the rest of the afternoon here. And our final projections really won't be something that I would be super confident in making a gut call like this until like maybe 30 minutes before lock. So I would definitely come back, check it out, rerun those test builds and see how things are looking before lock. I was messing around with this here about an hour before the show. And I was getting totally different results even just an hour before. Like when I ran this here, just about an hour ago, we were way over the field on guys like Giannis and Harden. And now it seems like even that has come down a little bit. So, but what I was saying is that you can add these detailed projections here. Actually, they're there by default. And these detailed projections, points, twos made, threes made, rebounds, assists, things like that. These are the average outcomes from what is happening in our thousands of game simulations for each game. So a very basic way of using SaberSim to bet on something like PrizePicks would be to just look at these means and compare what you're getting there, assuming you're just taking like even money props on your plays, right? If you are getting over under James Harden 26.5 points, right? We've got value on the under there, according to our game simulations. I think the sharper way to look at these, and again, I don't know how much a site like PrizePicks or a Monkey Knife Fight or something like that, I don't know how stale their lines get. But for NBA in particular, I'd recommend keeping an eye on the site when starting lineups come out. And if we get some surprise start or surprise news breaks or something like that, you're probably going to find stale lines and can take advantage of that just kind of intuitively. Was looking at this here, and while my audio was out, gave the example of, again, the Aldridge or Blake Griffin thing. If we got news that one of those guys was going to sit, I'm sure you can get a ton of value being over, betting LaMarcus Aldridge rebound overs or things like that if you knew for whatever reason that Blake Griffin wasn't going to sit because you were really plugged into the starting lineups. So that is one way I would recommend taking advantage of that here. The other way, I guess, would be to take a look at things like, well, let me see. I was going to say, I think one of the other ways, so correlation factors are going to be a lot smaller in NBA, but I think one of the ways that you could think about putting together sharper PrizePicks slips, right, would be to put together correlated bets. If you can. I'm not sure to what extent they allow you to do that. But if you click on a player, right, you can see correlation factors for certain players playing in the same game. And for a guy like Giannis, right, we see one of the players that he is most negatively correlated with is Jordan Nwora, right? Both wings. I think Nwora has a chance to actually play quite a few minutes tonight. I think he's going to be pretty popular in DFS. But they kind of do a similar thing, right? And I think Nwora's biggest upside is going to come in the event that he gets an opportunity to play a lot of minutes when Giannis isn't on the floor, soaking up that usage and rebounding and things like that, right? So if you could maybe put together I don't even know if PrizePicks refers to it as a parlay, but essentially a double slip where you're picking maybe Giannis overs and Nwora unders or something like that. That'd be a correlated bet, and I think you'd probably find some value there as well. So I think that's an interesting approach. Again, I think Kevin says now I can't hear him. I assume everybody else can. I'm holding on this thing and making sure that I'm not muted. So hopefully I'm not muted, but I'll wrap this question up here. I was saying before when I was muted here that a lot of times the lines you're getting on some of those prop betting sites like PrizePicks and things like that are going to be a little harder to beat than just what you might get at the books. So if that's all you have available, then that's all you have available. But they can be kind of tough lines to beat there at those sites. So. All right, everybody says they can hear me. Kevin, that might be on your end. I don't know. I don't know what's going on there, but man, it's like 40 chat messages when people said I was muted. I can't believe how long I did that. But anyway, I promise you guys, for all of you watching the stream for the first time, this is not my first time hosting this stream, even though it might seem like it. Acting like a noob here. But Mike said, your builders made me some great NHL teams. Would you suggest I lock in my stack and then clean up lineups from there, or let the sim run typically for single entry or small field GPP? Yeah, so I mean, there's really a lot of different ways to approach this kind of thing. I don't think there's necessarily a right way or a wrong way. One thing I always urge people to do if you are playing is to start with that test build and just see what the builder is giving you. It may be that, you know, you're getting a lot of exposure to the team that you like already and don't need to spend the time dialing in whatever settings you need or locking certain players to get a particular team in your lineups. You might also be exposed to the idea that a team or a stack has more upside than you originally thought when you were doing your own research. There's a lot of good things that can happen overall when you run a test build, which is why I always recommend people start there. Now, let's say you run your build and you're not getting a lot of the team or the stack that you in particular wanted to play, right? There's a few different options. I mean, one is maybe you go back and double check your research and see, is this really a team with upside? Is this a team that I want to be invested in? If you decide yes, I think there are a lot of ways that you can get some access to that team here in step one. You could bump up the team total. So maybe you're interested in playing the Avalanche tonight, right? And you weren't getting any of them in your test build, right? One of the easiest ways to get more of a team like that is to just up their team total here. Click yes. And we are going to appropriately bump the player projections for that entire team, right? And actually players playing on the other side of that game as well by updating our sims to isolate the bucket of individual game sims where Colorado's mean has become 3.5 goals, right? So I think that's one approach here. Let's see. Let me reset this. It looks like this question was also maybe a little bit more. Let me reset everything here. About locking in your stack for like a single entry or a small field GPP. If you were building single entry in particular, let's see. Let's run a build. Small field, we'll assume. Actually, I think for NHL, it's probably even a little bit more like that. And let's build just like 50 lineups. One of the ways that I like to play single entry, we got to update a couple projections here, is to allow SaberSim, rather than thinking about like hand building or hand choosing a stack, I will allow SaberSim to kind of give me a pool of lineups that I want to play with and then hand pick from there. So we'll build like 50 lineups here and then go through and actually hand pick. And this can be kind of a combination of having that feeling of hand building while also combining it with still what the model thinks is appropriate. Don said, for what it's worth, forcing SaberSim to stack in NHL is not as successful as letting it run. In NHL, you're forcing it to use suboptimal players. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Let me point out kind of why I think this is true of really any sport where you're doing stacking. This is true of baseball and football as well. You can always set these stacking rules, but especially for those of you that maybe don't know or aren't as familiar with SaberSim here, the reason why you don't have to, let's give this a second to update here. Okay, so the reason why you don't have to is because after simulating every single game on the slate thousands of times here, we know the actual coefficients of correlation between every player playing in that game, right? So you don't have to set a stack rule to force that you're getting line one stacks for Edmonton. We understand that the skaters skating on line one are very heavily correlated with one another, and we're going to build stacks of those players playing together, right? By default, no stacking rule set. And what Don is saying here is that by forcing a stacking rule using this stacking tool that we have here, you can potentially make the builder build lineups that are less optimal because it will still factor in correlation. You are putting rules based on intuition and rules of thumb into your lineups. So in general, I don't use the stacking rules too much. I think there is a reason to use them for certain sports. If there is a particular type of lineup that you are trying to avoid, maybe you don't want enormous stacks in your NHL lineup. So you say something like no more than, I don't even know, maybe 4 players from the same team or something like that. But in general, we're going to get nice stacks here without having to set a rule. But anyway, what I was saying about single entry in particular is one of my favorite approaches to this here is to just go into the pool here and just kind of look overall at your lineups. And maybe you had identified a certain team that you were interested in stacking. Looks like a lot of the Oilers tonight here. But maybe you wanted, I don't know, you can go through and kind of pick here. Or actually, let's do it like this so we can see this a little more clearly in a little bit more color. Again, I'm not a big NHL guy. So a little bit out of my element here, but you can look through these lineups here, and I'll do this for MLB a lot. If I'm just playing a single entry, I'll go through and I'll look maybe for a lineup that kind of pops for me for one reason or another that maybe has my stack in it that I wanted, and I'll let SaberSim kind of decide what the best lineup is to get that stack or something like that. So. Anyway, cool. Let me go ahead and move to the next question here. This one came in from Juan. Sorry, dumb question. I'm sure it's not. What is more important, a player's projection based on his salary or a player's minutes? I would say, ultimately it's going to be the player's projection because it is incorporating their minutes into it, right? Not all players are going to do the same thing on the court with 30 minutes. Not all players are... there's players that can be projected higher playing at lower minutes, and there's players that can be projected lower playing at lower minutes. I mean, the other thing is even all minutes are not the same, right? A player that gets 25 minutes running with mostly the first team maybe is going to get lower value minutes out of that time on the court than they would get if they had 25 minutes playing with the second team, right? They're going to get more usage. Their rates of rebounds and assists and things like that might be higher if they're playing with players that aren't as good. And the projections are going to incorporate all that kind of stuff into it in a way that minutes are not. Now, minutes obviously are super important. It's a primary input into the way that we simulate these games and project players. But ultimately, if you were trying to kind of if you had a single value that you had to make your lineups based on, I would definitely say that you should be making your lineups based on your projections instead of the player's minutes purely. So. Joel said, can you say which source SaberSim uses for NHL lines? Is there a regular frequency for these updates? For example, I look on Left Wing Lock and Twitter and change SaberSim if needed, but not knowing for sure who has the most recent news aside from Twitter. We use a combination of a few different sources. Left Wing Lock is on that list. RotoWire is on that list. Daily Faceoff is on that list. A few other NHL sites. I use a combination of kind of comparing information that we're getting from multiple sources to make updates to our sims on our end. If you ever notice something is off, especially as we approach lock, always feel free to pop us a message in the support channel on Slack or send us an email, support@sabersim.com. We'll figure out what's going on. But we use a combination of sources to make sure that we get updates as quickly as possible. So. Chase says, I just don't really understand the necessity for a research process when the builder has the capability of doing everything without any of my input. This is kind of a question that comes up a lot. I think on one hand, there is a great deal that is happening for you on SaberSim, especially compared to another, like a traditional optimizer or a tool that's just optimizing purely based off of average projections, right? I mentioned before our approach to ownership fade, right? This ownership fade slider is going to compare the variance of a player based on the difference between their ownership and the average ownership in a position and make a pretty intelligent approach to whether or not fading that player makes sense. Sim variance is bucketing game simulations randomly. And at 10, we're using single game simulations for each player when we build each lineup, right? Which is essentially giving you the right amount of like upside. It's a better approach than using like ceiling projections and traditional randomness on a traditional optimizer, right? We are actually taking out real possible game outcomes and building lineups around them, especially for a 2-game slate. That's super valuable. We'll value correlation on a typical slate. It's off tonight because it's just a 2-game slate. The impacts of correlation are pretty low here, but on an 11-game slate like we have tomorrow, we'll value correlation based on what we know about how players are correlated in certain game outcomes from our game simulation. So all of that to say that, a common question is I feel like SaberSim is doing all of this for me and I don't really know what to do. And it's important to remember that there's actually just a lot of value that's being added here. It is not as if you're doing nothing. If you did nothing and just plugged a traditional optimizer and just pressed go, right, you're not going to build very good lineups. On SaberSim, you're getting viable lineups right out of the gate. In terms of where you can add value, though, and where you can start to add some research, I think one of the best ways to do that is to look at situations that are unpredictable, right? If a star player is out, especially early in the season, looking at the way minutes are projected, and you don't even have to have the standpoint of like, I'm trying to be the sharpest NBA projection mind out there, right? I like to just take a game theory approach to this stuff a lot, and look at certain teams. I mean, one of the things I was diving into this morning is looking at these stars here at the top end. And one thing that immediately jumped to me was that these guys at the top across the entire slate here are all projected. They have about the same ceilings, right? Like these guys are all the Giannis, the Curry, the Hardens, the Durants, the LeBrons, right? They're all going to have about the same, especially these first five guys. They've all got about the same 65 to 75 point ceiling. I wouldn't be surprised, in other words, if any of these guys have that 65 or 75 point night. So one of the things I am very much keeping an eye on as we go into lock, just my personal approach, is checking to see if these ownerships start to get out of line. And I think we're already starting to see this Harden and Curry spread. I've noticed this here, even just looking at this beginning yesterday. Let's update again here, right? Okay, so ownership hasn't updated, but I've been seeing, this trend even cross-referencing across other sites that these guys are starting to get pretty high owned. So one of the things that I'm, going to be interested in looking at is to see if I can get a little bit of an edge rostering someone like Giannis, who I think also might be a little bit chalky, but maybe even like a Durant or LeBron, who I think all of these guys have similar ceilings at quite a bit of a lower ownership. That's just one of the things I'm approaching or looking at for this particular slate. Another way you can add value, and it's not even about game theory or updating projections or anything like that, is to just think about how you want to approach the slates from a risk management standpoint. So if we go back to our build that we ran at the start of the show here, you can update your exposures in step 3, not to get additional leverage on a player, not because you think he's over or under projected, but purely because you have a certain standpoint about how you want to approach risk on the slate, right? Someone that jumped off the screen to me was Thanasis Antetokounmpo here, who is projected for about 11 points at min salary and is showing up in quite a few lineups. But maybe 27.3% of my 150 lineups here is a bit too much risk to somebody that has a legitimate uncertain chance to even get on the court, right? I could bump his exposure down here in step 3 to maybe something like 15% and feel a little bit more comfortable with that amount of exposure. Damian Lee is another player, similar situation, right? Bump down some of these exposures on some of these guys that have a little bit of a uncertain chance of getting on the court overall. And that's adding value, right? And this isn't even so much necessarily on the research side, but this is a way of taking what SaberSim wants to give you by default and updating it to approach to better reflect the way that you want to handle the slate, right? So I think there's a lot of ways to go about this. It is always important to remember just how much SaberSim is automating for you, right? It's not as if you are just pressing a button and printing out average projected mean optimals, right? It's building lineups that have an intelligent approach to upside and ownership and correlation on a bigger slate. But there are still a ton of ways to add value. So cool. Okay, I'm going to keep going. I'm catching up here to the section of the chat where I had muted myself originally. Anyway, cool. Looking for other questions that came in here. DCC said, if I want an off the chalk build in NBA, what's the best pass to get to this? Up the sliders for fade ownership or just projections that are in place? There's a lot of different ways to go about this. I'll start with this. So the first way that I think is the easiest way, the easiest way to start getting less chalky builds here is going to be to adjust your ownerships, your exposures in step 3. And the reason I like to approach it this way is that you are taking a pool of lineups that were built with the sliders that have been optimized for a particular contest type, and then just making adjustments of which lineups that you are taking into the contest with you. So for example, right, let's look at this build. We ran this, right? And let's say we wanted to be, very contrarian in our approach to this particular slate. We're building 150 lineups. We have a pool of 500 here, right? We can sort by ownership and then just making sure that we are underweight on most of the players here at the top end, especially maybe some of these value guys. And just how underweight we want to be is ultimately up to your own risk tolerance or how contrarian you want to be, right? We could say that we want to be half the field on some of these top end projected owned guys. So we start setting max exposures to some of these top guys here, and we can just keep going here. And the effect of dropping our exposure to all of these highest projected owned players in the pool is that the lineups themselves are going to become quite a bit less chalky. Now, at some point, you're going to get this message here that says we need to expand the lineup pool. And this is actually the reason why I like to approach it this way, because what this message is actually saying is that we can't find 150 lineups in your initial pool of 500 that match what your exposures are. In other words, to get to 150 lineups that the model likes, we have to exceed the first 500 it wanted to build, which maybe is an indication that we're getting too off the wall here. We've actually taken this too far, and maybe we just walk back something like our most recent exposure edit, and we feel pretty good about going in with lineups like this. Now, this is only going to work on your kind of full portfolio level, right? By changing our exposures to certain players, we're not actually changing the lineups themselves. We're not making the actual lineup constructions less chalky. We are making our overall exposures to certain players in the pool less chalky. If you wanted to just force the builder to actually build you less chalky lineups, the next thing I would do is probably adjust the ownership fade slider. And I think bumping this up a couple notches can be a really good way to just kind of very bluntly across your entire portfolio, make your lineups have a little bit less ownership in them. I don't really think that you are going to lower the EV of your lineups too much by adjusting this up 1 or 2 slots. I would take a light approach to this at first and maybe try it up 1 or up 2, and then rebuild and see what your lineups look like before you are just maxing this out at 10 and going from there. But I think this can be a really good approach. If you had a particular angle on the slate that you wanted to do, then I think you can justify looking at the projections overall. You could accomplish that here as well. Like maybe your angle is Harden's going to be popular, right? Maybe your angle is that you have the Durant ceiling game and Harden doesn't have as good of a game as a result, right? You could do that here in step 3, just purely by going and finding Durant, and maybe you set a minimum exposure of double the field on Durant. And on Harden, maybe you are half the field, right? And maybe that's one of the ways, maybe that's one of your angles on the slate. But if you wanted to take a more direct approach and build lineups that kind of, again, rather than adjusting your portfolio of lineups, actually approach the way the lineups are constructed, you could come at this from the standpoint of adjusting projections here and maybe make an adjustment to Harden and bump Durant or something like that. Anything you are doing before your build, though, whether you are adjusting sliders or you are adjusting projections, is riskier because you are now changing the inputs to the system and you're adjusting the model, right? In some way, you are flatly disagreeing with the way that our sims have simulated the games, and you are going to build a brand new pool of lineups where the inputs have been changed, right? The system has been kind of edited. I do almost all of my adjustments, almost all the value I add to my process for any sport ends up ultimately taking place in step 3. Because I like to know that I've built a big pool of 500 or 1,500 lineups in line with the way the model wants to approach the slate, using these pool of 500 or 1,500 lineups that we think are viable, and then making my selections of which lineups I want to take into battle with me. But I know that's not for everybody. And some people prefer to make more adjustments in step 1 and then know that their pool of lineups 100% all reflect the way they want to attack the slate, right? So it really, there's with a lot of these questions about process, there's not so much a right or a wrong way do these things. It kind of depends on what you are actually looking for. And if you are just totally unsure, I would add more of your value here post build in step 3 rather than messing around with things in step 1 or 2. So Jason says, why did my SaberSim have a white color scheme and does not show ownership in the lineup section? It changed once I bought the sports betting add-on. Dark mode can be turned on or off in the settings tab up here. So I have dark mode on right now. You can turn it off. I'm sure this is blinding for you guys. That's why normally for the stream, I leave it on most of the time, but you can turn that on or off here. Does not show ownership in the lineup section here. This is all totally customizable. So you can change these columns here, change the order. If you are not seeing a column that you want, it is just in this edit exposure columns button here. So the reason why you're not seeing ownership is because it probably was unchecked. And you can just add it back in here by checking it in. So cool. Awesome. Let's see. Richard said, if there's a player that you want to take a stance on to get some ownership, if you want to take a stance on to get some ownership fade, is locking that player and then running the builder the best way to see lineups with that player? Or should you just run the build and search for that player and adjust exposures? My approach would be to, rather than locking that player pre-build, would be to just see what happens here in post-build. So like, let's say you wanted to see what are the best possible Chris Middleton lineups I can build tonight, right? You could actually press lock, right? But a lot of times we're going to see this message here. I think a better way to do it would be to use the filter icon. And the filter icon is going to say, just show me any lineup that is using Chris Middleton, which he should be highlighted here. That looks like maybe a small bug, but he's not. But this is going to show you all Chris Middleton lineups. So if you're just purely looking at constructions here, this is the easiest way to do that. Like, what are the best looking Chris Middleton lineups tonight? Well, they're these ones, according to the builder. If you had decided that you are just playing Chris Middleton no matter what, maybe you're playing only 3 lineups and you're just taking a stance, then you can go ahead and just lock him here in step 1, and then set your sliders. You're playing, maybe it's a 3 max that has 500 or 5,000 people in it, something like that, right? Then you can just build, and then you know your entire pool has Chris Middleton in it. So again, I think maybe from the practical stance of this question, if you had totally decided that you were locking in a player, I would just lock them in step 1 so that you know you have 100% of your lineups with that player in it. But I wouldn't make that decision until you at least ran some test builds with no players locked and just seeing what the pool looks like. So Don said, any chance of getting a PPM column and or usage? I definitely see how that would be useful. Those are 2 things that I'm in general pretty interested in. A lot of the research that I end up doing, if I'm going to do anything off of SaberSim, is for those kinds of things. I mean, points per minute, you can kind of make, the quick and dirty calculation in your head, just dividing by projection by minutes, and get an idea of where that line is drawn. But I can definitely see how those things would be useful. So I will pass that along. The one problem here is, like, all of this information comes directly from the sims. Points per minute is very easy to do, right? We could just take the actual average projection, divide it by the average minutes, and call it points per minute and be good. Usage is a little harder. I guess an average usage across all sims maybe is interesting. But that number, like when you see it elsewhere, is typically a historical average. And I'm trying to think about how we would calculate that number from simulation data. But I'll pass it along. So definitely see how that would be useful there. All right, cool. Let's see. I see a couple other questions had come in office hours in the Slack channel here. This one was from Zach. And Zach said, does SaberSim adjust for things like minute restrictions? Yes, they do. Or we do. It's typically a manual adjustment. So we keep an eye on the news. If we get news or a coach's quote or a beat writer or something that we trust and makes us think that there is a minutes restriction on a guy, we'll update our sims, update our information on our end, and resimulate the game. That's the kind of stuff that, has just a huge ripple effect on the game overall in NBA is so important. So we are absolutely staying plugged into that kind of thing and making adjustments as news like that is breaking. So anyway, that is all I see for questions here. Appreciate everybody that tuned into the stream. As always, we are happy to answer questions leading up until lock. If you are not already in the Slack channel, I recommend joining up. Again, there will be a link in the description of this video once it is posted up on YouTube here, but you can join our Slack community by following the link that's in the description of any past office hours videos we've done. Always happy to answer questions in Slack leading up to lock as you guys are building your lineups. You can also email us, support@sabersim.com. Always keeping an eye on email leading up to lock. Happy to answer questions there. I mentioned here twice already this stream. I'll say it one more time. We reset everybody's trial today for the start of NBA season. If you have ever tried SaberSim, use the 7-day trial, whether you didn't like it or for one reason or another canceled, you can come back, get a free 7 days. So go to sabersim.com. You can just log back in if you already have an account. If you don't, you can click start trial up here or here, sign in, get a free, no strings attached 7 days, get an opportunity to check us out for basketball tonight, all week, football this weekend, before you even have to pay a dime. So definitely recommend trying that out. Enjoy opening night tonight. It's going to be a lot of fun. Don said, yes, you were muted for that one. Gotcha. Yeah. Well, now I'm not, so hopefully everybody can hear me. Bryson did say, I'll answer this question here before we move on. Will we ever be able to sort our lineups by total ownership percent? Yes, it's on our radar to do that. Again, I would caution you to just be careful with that. The ownership sum, I think, means less than it looks like it does, right? It is not very predictive of what the overall expected value for a lineup is, right? And it is also not very predictive of how likely a lineup is to be duplicated, which I think are the two most useful things that you could get out of this calculation. But yes, our goal here long term is to give people the ability to sort by projected ownership and to make some changes to your lineups overall from there. But anyway, guys, enjoy opening night tonight. Let me know if you have any questions here in Slack, support, anything like that. And we will be right back here again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. Our plan is to do a strategy session, have Matt and Will on talking about the NBA simulator, how our model is put together for NBA. So it should be a lot of fun. I will see you guys then. Take care. See ya.